So it's great to come back here. I was the first GYC communications director the year after the fires. I've been a proud Greater Yellowstone journalist for almost 30 years, and I wrote this book on Ted Turner that has a heavy GYC emphasis. It's about Ted, who's been a board member and board member emeritus. It also includes Mike Finley, who has been serving on the GYC board. One thing I want to point out tonight, this is an incredible historic trifecta. You should look upon these guys as the three tenors coming together. So you think about, in a couple of years, the National Park Service will be 100 years old. Combined between Bob Barbee, Mike Finley, and Dan Wenk, you have well over a century of institutional knowledge and experience, which is really incredible to be assembled. So what I'd like to do is we'll introduce each of them one at a time, and they'll come up, and I'll provide a little background information as they take the stage. First, we have Bob Barbee. Yeah. Bob was superintendent in Yellowstone from 1982 to 1994. He had a Park Service career that stretched 42 years. During Bob's tenure, the role of science, wildlife protection, and ecosystem management were greatly advanced. While his cumulative achievements in Yellowstone are too numerous to recount, he'll always be remembered for his skillful handling of the 88 fires. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees from Colorado State University. The Department of Interior has honored him with its three highest honors: Superior Service, Distinguished Service, and Meritorious Service. Let's give Bob a round of applause. Great, have a seat. No, have a seat right now. Next, I'd like to introduce Mike Finley. Mike has a career that spanned 32 years managing natural and cultural resources in the Park Service, including 6.5 years in Yellowstone. When wolves were introduced, Mike was the one of the few who carried in those initial crates, if you remember. Today, he's president of the Turner Foundation, an environmental grant-making foundation that awards an average of $12 million annually to grassroots groups, including GYC. And over its tenure, it has handed out over $360 million. Mike's a graduate of Southern Oregon University with a bachelor's degree in biology. The Department of Interior has honored him also with its three highest awards: Superior Performance, Meritorious Service, and Distinguished Service. Let's give a hand to Mr. Finley. Thirdly, we have Dan Wenk, who is in active duty. As many of you know, he came to Yellowstone in 2011. He was Deputy Director of Operations for the Park Service in Washington for close to 4 years, helping to guide the management of 394 National Park units. He's also served as Acting Director of the Park Service during the transition period at the early years of the Obama administration. He's a graduate of Michigan State University with a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture and was landscape architect in Yellowstone from 1979 to 1984. The Department of Interior has awarded Superintendent Wenk with its highest awards, the Meritorious Service Award, Secretary Executive Leadership Award twice, and the Meritorious Presidential Rank Award. Let's all give a warm welcome to Superintendent Wenk. So what we're going to do now is we're going to have each of our superintendents, beginning with Bob Barbee, offer a 5-minute overview of their careers.
Oh, am I on?
You can sit right here if you want, I think.
Sit right. Don't I get to go up there?
Your choice.
You wanted me to sit right here? No, I've got one of these special things. I don't want that. Unless people can't hear me. Yeah. I noticed that Rick Reese didn't go around and go up the steps. He jumped up here. And Todd Wilkinson felt he had to help me up the steps. So thank you. We have 5 minutes, and my time hasn't started yet. And I can't clear my throat in 5 minutes. So I feel like a corpse at an Irish wake. You're supposed to be present, and you're supposed to occupy a position of some prominence, but you're not supposed to say a lot. So that'll fit, won't it? Paul Scolari, a former colleague and a good friend, counsels me about things like this. And I said, what do you think I should say to these people? They got 5 minutes. And he said, well, don't tell them stuff they already know or that they can look up. So, okay, that's a tall order. And so I'll start at the beginning. I got here to Yellowstone in January of 1983, and I was in Redwood National Park, Northern California, and I got a call from a director at the time, Russ Dickinson, and he said, we're fishing around for someone to go to Yellowstone. And I thought, well, why are you telling me this? And he said, I want you to go. So after I picked myself up off the floor, he said, there's a hitch. And, of course, there's always a hitch. And I said, well, what's the hitch? He said, the secretary wants to personally interview you and our selection and so on. And the secretary was James Watt. Well, I hadn't met James Watt, but I knew that he had quite a reputation, of course, and I didn't think he was too cozy with California liberals. And so I said, well, that probably finishes me off. But I said, okay, we'll give it a shot. So I got my hair cut real short. I wore a dark blue suit, a red tie. I wore a rotary pin to sort of a salute to the laissez-faire, and I thought, well, here we go. Well, actually, James Watt and I got along very well, and it was a very congenial conversation. And when it ended, and he said, you really need to talk to the assistant secretary. So go down and talk with him. Now, the assistant secretary's name was G. Ray Arnett. And Ray Arnett had been he's a California, really a hook and bullet guy all the way. And not into all this fuzzy stuff. And and so anyway, I'd had an issue with him over salmon and rice in Redwood. But that's another story. Anyway, we had a nice conversation, at the end of which he said, oh, by the way, Bob, or he didn't call me Bob, he said Barbee. Puts a little slightly different inflection on it. And he said, if we so much as get a hint that you're flirting with bringing back wolves to Yellowstone, you are going to go to South Yemen, that's when it was a country, as a park planner. Is that clear? I said, well, I'm glad to smoke you out on that issue. So anyway, so it began. And actually, Ray Arnett he came across as pretty gruff and so on, but we got along very well. So it began. Now my 5 minutes begins. So, what do you say about 12 years in Yellowstone in 5 minutes? And so just a whole host of things came, and still do come, sort of waffling through your mind. And so I wrote a few. I just cherry picked a few off the tree. And the first one was that we had a new concessionaire the buildings, the hotels were falling apart, literally. There was no fire protection to speak of, which always gets my attention. And we had the financial situation was a mess. Now, my concession experience at Cape Hatteras was worrying about the price of bloodworms on these docks that go out. And we had a little tiny hotel in Hawaii Volcanoes. Otherwise, I'm not used to dealing with these high rollers. But so we had, that takes time. It's not a sexy topic with a group like this always, but that took a lot of time. For example, there was I noticed some of our Yellowstone buses in Bozeman, and I asked someone, I said, where are those buses going? Well, he said, they're running gambling tours to Jackpot, Nevada. I said, that's government property. There are people that frown on stuff like that. So, there was all kinds of things that dominated your time. Grizzly bears. I went to a meeting early on in Salt Lake City, and the word on the streets was one more female out of the system, and they're going to swirl down the black hole into extinction in Yellowstone. I didn't really believe that, but it certainly made good press. And but the grizzly bears were sort of on kind of a brink in a way, and for a lot of reasons. And so grizzly bears and a huge educational program dominated our effort early on. Right here in this town, we had to convince people that they couldn't leave their little bowls out for their dog food, and they had to clean up their trash. Now look at it; it's wonderful. And so there are all kinds of stuff like that. So grizzly bears are a big deal. There's always something. There's a parade of things. As I told Dan Wenk, I said, Wenk, when you go to Yellowstone as a superintendent, you walk in the door, you're going to be in a state of siege until you walk out the door. Then somebody else will take over, and that's the same thing will happen to them. Fishing bridge, closing not the bridge itself, people thought it was a bridge, but all the development around Fishing Bridge. Big deal. It was like a 5-year blood bath. And there had been a trade-off made. You want to develop Grand Village, then you got to close all that stuff at Fishing Bridge. Well, you think, you just don't do that. Somebody made a deal, but you got to go through, there's all this EIS stuff and all these troublesome things like that. So people were in a hurry to have that done. Earth First was driving things. And they came to Mammoth one day, and they presented me with an award. I was the bio-prostitute of the year. I'm serious. And the award wasn't a nice plaque like Rick Reese got. It was a wet buffalo pie. And I thought this guy was going to throw it at me. I think but he didn't. And there was a lot of people in the room. I didn't think there was any media there. And so I said as nicely as I could, well, you can take your award and shove it. And I think it was the Billings Gazette the next day, it was take your award and shove it. And then, on page 12 is shove it continues. So much for that. Anyway, along came Alston Chase. I don't think he's here tonight, but he wrote a book, Playing God in Yellowstone. And it's in my opinion, a really awful book. And so I spent a year following Alston Chase around. The director said, I want you to be everywhere that Alston Chase is. I thought, well, he's everywhere, I'll do what I can. So we sort of had a road and pony show. And, there's always these kind of individuals around for a park superintendent. No matter where you are, they pop up. And the next guy to pop up was Cleveland Amory, Fun for Animals. And he was a trip. And, of course, they were really after, we were killing bison. We and the state were killing bison because they, as they moved out of the park, it was a big year. And death is a hard sell, And so anyway, Cleveland Amory was really on our back. And he has a board of directors, very star-studded board of directors and what have you, and he gets a lot of national attention. Well, Cleveland Amory and I were on Good Morning America. And I told the producers, I said, you better be careful because he can get he can become profane and me say some words that you probably will make you blanch at least. And so anyway, we met on Good Morning America. He started out the program with, he said, that Bob Barbee is a contract killer. He'd shoot his own mother if she had 4 legs. Well, that's quite a start, for a national program. That's a true story. Well, anyway, so things like that were happening all the time to kind of spice things up. Of substance, we reorganized some of the park, and I came from a natural resource background, so we decided that we need to give this more focus, more visibility, maybe a more professional spin. And so John Varley and I decided that we would create the Center for Yellowstone Resources and include cultural resources, which had been somewhat ignored. So that was kind of a big deal, and it took a lot of time. Along the way, early on, was the GYC. And I recall very well, we had a staff meeting in Mammoth, and Bob Anderson and Rick Reese came to the staff meeting to tell us about this new organization. And, they're fairly eloquent, because a lot of these organizations, they pop up like mushrooms after a spring rain. And, they all have angels dancing on their shoulder and the suns in their face. So we thought, well, here's maybe another one, but this seemed to have a slightly different angle, because they're concerned about the entire Yellowstone area or ecosystem, if you will. And anyway, that was the beginning of the relationship with the coalition, and now look at it. So it's just tremendous what they've done. And along the way, after the first couple of years, Ed Lewis came on board, and he just did really wonderful things, I think, for the coalition. And the white-hot center was Louisa Wilcox. Now you want a piece of work, there was one. We should all give Louisa, I don't think she's here tonight, but she just was always on our back. But it was okay. And so that was my introduction to the GYC. And then, of course, there's the 88 fires. Now, we don't need to spend much time talking about those. That was a character-building experience for me, for sure. We sat right here in this room with all the fire gods. Right back there where Bob Kiter's sitting right now. And somebody got up, one of the meteorologists from Washington basically said, it's hopeless. We're not going to get nothing's going to control this thing. And sure enough, that was Black Saturday. And I think the fire expanded a couple 100,000 acres is all. But it was, the fires of 88 were certainly, as far as I'm concerned, a big part of the time. Winter use, we can go on. Our association with the Church Universal and Triumphant, and the list goes on. And then there was wolves, and I don't want to talk a lot about wolves, but 10 years with wolves. And if you really want to have an experience, it's to go to a meeting like this, which is the annual meeting of the Wyoming Wool Growers. And you stand up and tell them what a great idea it is to introduce wolves. So anyway, and then to move to Alaska and sit in my living room, and turn the TV on, and unceremoniously, I may add, and who is there but Mike Finley helping to carry in the wolves into the park. So I think that's more, and I think that's way more than my 5 minutes.
Now do you know why we miss Bob Barbee with his quotable? Mike, please jump in.
Well, my introduction to coming to Yellowstone was at the time I was superintendent of Yosemite National Park. And the director of the Park Service at the time had detailed me to Washington, D.C. to the number 3 job, the Associate Director for Operations, for 6 months. And while I was there in Washington, D.C., I was approached by the then Deputy Director to say, how would you like to go to Alaska? And I'd served in Alaska as the Associate Director for Operations. So I said, well, let me think about it. A couple of weeks later, he comes in and he said, how would you like to go to Yellowstone? I said, I thought I was thinking about Alaska. And he said, no, we're going to send Barbee there. He's smarter than you are. That's a true story, by the way. So I scheduled to get out of my corporate apartment, go back to Yosemite, clean up what mess I could, and I arrive in Yellowstone about November 3rd or 4th of 1994. I tried to get moved in over the weekend, but there were 6 of these yellow phone messages on my desk from then Governor Roscoe of Montana about bison crossing into Montana with this terrible disease that, by the way, the cattle gave to the bison. Came across with the colonist cattle. That always irritated me, that we were responsible for a disease, a social disease, that they gave the bison. But anyway, he was calling me to tell me that he was going to litigate, but we never made connections, so I read about it in the paper. So what we were asked to do was set the political, maybe natural resource landscape. So that was my first arrival, shock. Later that same month, staff came in and said, guess what? We have lake trout in Yellowstone Lake. Of course, there have been rumors of that over the years, but every time someone came up to a park ranger and said, we caught a lake trout in Yellowstone Lake, they'd pat him on the head and say, you know, it's only Yellowstone cutthroat. We really don't have lake trout. Well, this one brought in the corpus. And in fact, we did have lake trout, and probably had them for a number of years, decimating the cutthroat, the Yellowstone cutthroats. So that was my second issue. Shortly thereafter, for years, the Park Service had been giving collection permits. We gave them routinely. Moths, butterflies, ants. I remember in Yosemite we gave a collection permit for black bear's blood. And the scientific purpose behind that was, even though they eat a lot of meat and other vegetables, they have almost 0 cholesterol in their blood. So why is that a key mechanism? So, you know, we did invasive. We allowed them to take blood out of bears. So I felt, after consulting with our chief scientist, John Varley, at the time, about microbes in Yellowstone's hotspots, that we should allow science to sample these microbes and further benefit society, because absolutely some of them, like Sophilobus, is a genus that eats only sulfur. Well, sulfur bonds in your tires are what make them hard. So if you can have these little microbes eat sulfur bonds, you can recycle tires. Huge benefits. DNA fingerprinting comes from Yellowstone. If you think about Thermus aquaticus is the organism, polymerase is the enzyme, PCR is called polymerase chain reaction. That's how you unzip a DNA that we use for forensics and formetics. So there's huge benefits in our society right now derived from Yellowstone. So I signed an agreement with Diversa Corporation saying, go forth, do good, and by the way, you don't get to patent these things, and we get the benefits back. I mean, just think how well-funded Yellowstone would be if we had the rights and had the money returned for polymerase chain reaction. You could fund half the Park Service, probably. Anyway, that was an issue. Got sued for that by the Alliance of the Wild Rockies because they thought I was some sort of person that was allowing microbe mining. And my chief scientist at the time, John Varley, said, these people are taking more of Yellowstone out on the soles of their shoes than a pipette of a microbe from a Yellowstone hotspot. Wolves. You know, to Bob Barbee's credit, he worked very, very hard and did allow all of us to see the tremendous biological benefits that have been derived from reintroducing the wolf. So I arrived in time to get the death threats. The injunction that left the wolves in Great Falls, Montana, that they had to be intubated in their cages so they didn't dehydrate. The good friend of mine, Rob Wallace, who was a chief of staff for Governor Geringer, calls me up and says, the governor and I want to talk you out of releasing those wolves in Yellowstone. Well, it's only a secretarial decision. It had been laid. There's no way that my friendship was going to allow me to say no. In fact, I had a personal thought to myself that if the court ordered them to be destroyed or something, I was going to release them myself. But that was a rather controversial time that continued with safeguarding we actually had two caravans. One was a dummy decoy like you would do with a presidential motorcade, and the other had the real wolves. And there was a serious time about getting them into the park, safeguarding them. That was an issue. The New World Mine fight began and continued to stop that terrible mine proposal. And then there were some things that we did during that period about revisiting the Yellowstone fires. Bob did a wonderful job of handling a fire event of the century. We asked the press to come back and see us 10 years later, and got on the front page of 67 newspapers the fact that Yellowstone was not destroyed, but was actually reborn. That was an important message for fire management throughout the United States on federal, state, and other public lands. We engaged in a winter use plan and ultimately made a decision on snowmobiles. We had two presidential visits from President Clinton, one vice presidential visit during the 125th celebration, and we gave birth and growth to the Yellowstone Park Foundation. And so that kind of sets the stage for all of you for further remarks about what was going on for my 6.5 years in Yellowstone.
It occurs to me, listening to these two gentlemen, that how much a debt of gratitude I owe to them as the current superintendent. You know, I walked in, I remember the first time I met Bob Barbee. He was not yet been allowed to move into the superintendent's residence. I think you were down in the old guardhouse or someplace at the end of Officers Row, and I walked in and he looked at me and he said, "So you're Dan Wenk." And it went from there.
He was a really vibrant young guy there. Now look at
him. My introduction to Yellowstone is I had the great fortune of getting an opportunity to work for two legendary superintendents in Yellowstone. The first being John Townsley. He brought me to Yellowstone in 1979. And I came to Yellowstone as the park landscape architect and sort of moved into a position of a management assistant. And that's what I was doing when John came into the park, when Bob came into the park. If any of you had the opportunity to know both those superintendents, an incredible dichotomy of management styles, but both incredible advocates for Yellowstone National Park and all it is becoming still today. The other thing, and so I had that opportunity, and I lost my way for a while and went to some other places and did some other things, but I was in Washington, D.C., and had great opportunities in Washington to work, with the National Park System overall. But Suzanne Lewis announced that she was going to retire, and I had the opportunity to go in to see Secretary Salazar and tell him that I wanted to come to Yellowstone. That there's sort of one time in everybody's career in the National Park Service when you get a chance to manage a Yellowstone National Park. It was actually a long conversation, but a good conversation. And Secretary Salazar understood that these chances in a person's career only come along once, to go to a place and go to Yellowstone. It's the only job I would have left Washington, D.C. for. It's, in my opinion, you may be under siege, but it's the best job in the National Park Service. The thing that struck me when I came back is that Yellowstone's a healthier park than it was when I left in 1984. It's a healthier park because of the reestablishment of, if you will, the prey-predator relationships. It's a healthier park because of the wolves and grizzly bear, things Bob talked about in terms of the concession footprint and how we're treating visitors. But it's a park that still has incredible number of problems, still the same problems that were in the two gentlemen to my right and left we're dealing with today. Probably the first thing that hit me when I came back into the park was bison. If you remember the spring of 2011, it was a very, very heavy snow year. We probably had about 800 bison out on the landscape in the Gardner Basin. And we had, we were allowed to have, I believe, 25 outside, that would be allowed outside of the park. And I had an opportunity shortly after I arrived to drive to Helena, Montana and sit down with Brian Schweitzer. And in that meeting, he started to explain to me how we should be ranching bison in Yellowstone National Park. And he explained to me that how they do it in Montana. And he started to explain to me how the National Park Service was hunting elk in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And I had happened to negotiate the deal with the state of North Dakota and at that time Governor Hoeven, and in terms of what we were going to do. And so I was able to say to the governor, we're not hunting elk in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. What we're doing is we're doing a management reduction. This is how it's being done, and this is a set of circumstances that we're doing it. Those circumstances don't exist in Yellowstone National Park in terms of the bison and what's happening on the landscape. And we're not going to hunt in Yellowstone National Park. And so the conversation began with Governor Schweitzer. It was interesting because after that, I had frequent calls from the governor that would typically start out with, Dan, this is Brian. What are you going to do with your damn bison? It was typically after a foray out of the park on the northern boundary. But the interesting thing in that exchange was we had a plan for how we were going to deal with bison. A plan none of us liked. It was going to have to be remove bison because we were above the limits and ship some to slaughter that would go to Native American tribes for, as we say, cultural and nutritional purposes. But the governor prohibited us from shipping bison. So he was actually compounding the problem. In fact, he's prohibited us for shipping for the last 2 years. So the problem escalates, and now we have 4,650 bison in the park, not the 3,000 bison that had been negotiated previously. You look at lake trout and restoration of cutthroat trout on the lake. The problem, that's one of the first issues that the resource management staff brought to me. And what are we going to do? We had been doing an effort to remove lake trout on Lake Yellowstone, and that effort had been progressing steadily but slowly, and we were losing the battle. There were more and more lake trout and less cutthroat trout. We went from a population of approximately 4 million cutthroat trout in Lake Yellowstone to estimates of only 400,000. And the lake trout were increasing. So what we did is we took that and we decided, we engaged with the Yellowstone Park Foundation, created by Mike Finley's time here, and we more than doubled our efforts. In the last 3 years, we've now removed, in the total time, we've removed now about 1.3 million lake trout from the lake. But in the last 3 years, we've removed almost 800,000 of those lake trout. And there's signs that we're making progress and that we're going to have success on the lake. Keystone species, that's critically important to the ecosystem. Winter use, both these gentlemen dealt with winter use. I believe we're on the cusp of a solution. And I believe that solution is going to make the park quieter, cleaner, less harassing to wildlife, and allow for more visitation. It seems counterintuitive, but I think we have a fragile coalition of the unwilling who all agree that this is a solution that will work for us. So wolves continues to be an incredible debate. I think that those debates, and right now the Fish and Wildlife Service is on a schedule to potentially delist grizzly bears in 2014. Wolves may just be a trial run for what might happen with grizzly bears. How are we going to deal with that issue? And I think just in terms of the intersection with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, the coalition is critical to us in terms of truly being a coalition of environmental groups and stakeholders that can help us to take the ecosystem message, if you will, to the decision makers who are going to make decisions that affect these species of animals outside the park. And the relationship that the strength of the coalition when I stepped into as superintendent is reassuring, and I'm very pleased and proud to be able to work with you. That's it.
So now we'll move into a few questions. You have a couple of minutes.
We're good at that.
And the first one is, we'll start with Superintendent Barbee. What were your greatest challenges that you faced as superintendent? And looking back, what are you happy today having accomplished?
Well, the greatest challenge, clearly, were the Yellowstone fires. I mean, how can you beat that? And the greatest accomplishment was on September 11th, I made it rain. So, put it out, the fires went out. Well, you know, we were actually told about some of these questions, and that question, I thought, well, what in the world can I say? And, because, you know, you got to understand one thing for sure, and here sits three of us up here, that there's a whole bunch of people behind us making things happen. And we sort of are up front, but there's the worker bees that are making it really happen. What was the question again?
I'm reading the questions. What were the greatest challenges you faced?
Well, I said the fires. And wolves were challenging. A lot of things were challenging. You know, when you are sitting there as a superintendent and the safety officer of the park comes to the staff meeting, and you sort of brace yourself because there's never good news. And usually it's got to be aware of black ice. And this morning I noticed that in the maintenance guy didn't scrape the ice off his windows. He put a cup of hot coffee up there and the little, there's stuff like that. Well, anyway, this guy comes in and rolls across our mahogany table pipes that he had cut out of one of the hotels. He says, I want you to take a look at those pipes. That's our water system. I mean, that's our sprinkler system. So I looked at it. Of course, you know what you're going to get. They're just clogged tight. There's no way a drop of water could get through those pipes. So, then we had to shift $3 million from one project like making the back of the Lake Hotel look nice, look like the front, over to fix the water. So there's all that kind of stuff going on. Winter use. You know, we told the concessionaire was coming in with some proposals all the time about new stuff they wanted to do. You know, frying bacon out at some place. Stuff that we didn't really want to do. There was nothing there to guide them. It was kind of on a case-by-case basis. So we called a couple of staff in, bright young people, and said, I want you to do, this is what I said, I want you to knock out a winter use plan. I don't want it to have a lot of visibility. We got to get some guidance for a lot of this activity that's starting to take place. We opened the Mammoth Hotel, and it took. So there was winter use going on. I said, why don't you plan a horizon of about 6 weeks to knock this thing out? Well, is it knocked out now?
No.
Okay. Well, anyway, so there were challenges. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. They got this. I've never seen one of these little things, but they're marvelous. So anyway, I didn't answer your question, but there's just all kinds of stuff that go on all the time, every day. And there's just all kinds of people, good people, working on it. And then there's the external constituencies that are in there, like the coalition, you know. So that's my 2 minutes up.
Yes. Mike?
Well, just to share with the audience, we were asked to look at our position. What were we able to accomplish on our own? What were we able to finish? Like in the case of Bob Barbee, started with the wolves. He did all the paperwork, did all the politics, got the secretarial order. I was there to make sure that they were safeguarded in the next phase. Now Dan has that. And then, so what are the things that were our challenges? You know, one of the things that I look at as one of the greatest successes was when I was at Yosemite, I was fortunate to be able to work with the typical museum association, which is maps and books, and they do great things for education and interpretation. But the previous superintendent had established the Yosemite Fund, and it was a very different type of board, high-end individuals who brought in great amount of capital to do the things in Yosemite that you couldn't even touch over a programmed basis. And when I came to Yellowstone, there was a very credible museum association and educational branch, but I saw a great need for what I had enjoyed working with in Yosemite. So I resolved that we would have a Yellowstone fund in that thing. And we spun it off. I worked with the existing museum association. At one point, they approached me during a board meeting at Old Faithful, and I remember standing at the bridge and at the fire hole, and the chairman of the board came down, and he said, we've been thinking about what you said about this foundation. We'd like to run it. And that means we'd have the Educational Institute, and we would have the typical museum. And I said, I appreciate that, but you must understand, one way or another, there will be a Yellowstone Foundation in Yellowstone. And we have that, and it's worked very well. And some of those you know John Good, I was able to put together the first board. Under law, you needed 3 board members, and John Good volunteered to be the first one, former superintendent of the Everglades. We hired our first executive director, Lisa Diekman. Many of you remember Lisa, and she worked at the Yellowstone Park Foundation for years and the Wilderness Society. So that was something that is a gift. If you're lucky in this job that we shared to leave something behind, I always call it the gift that keeps on giving. Rick Reese, you and your colleagues who put together the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, you gave the gift that keeps on giving. And that was the fun. I was able to finish the construction, the design and construction of the Snow Lodge in Old Faithful. Bob had done the preliminary planning and so forth. I was able to start but not finish the new courthouse construction in Mammoth. The Administrative Office of the United States Courts agreed that it was not safe under current court standards for a U.S. magistrate. It was improper, inadequate office space. So we did obtain the funding and did a partnership and constructed a new courthouse. We took Bob's design of the Cultural Resources Center, the Center for Resources, and actually moved out all the warehouse. It was more than half warehouse, and there was a little, about 25% of it actually housed staff, and we diverted a lot of funding, and it was wonderful to fulfill Bob's idea of having staff but with adequate offices and conference space and so forth. So that was something that I was happy to see happen. One of the things that you don't get an opportunity very often is we rebuild roads and reconfigure road bases and park roads all the time. I always looked at every job that we did in roads and parking lots with an idea, how can we move it out of sensitive resource areas? And they were about to redo the road in the Gibbon Canyon, for those of you who rode that road for years, right next to the Gibbon, right in the floodplain or where there should have been a riparian zone. And they were going to have to build these huge concrete areas to keep the landslides, which sometimes, in a couple cases, came down and knocked cars into the Gibbon River. So we had this huge safeguarding issue. And I just said, this is beautiful. Let's move this road out of the canyon. Let's give this river a mile and a half to restore. And we did that. And I think you should all be pleased that, sometimes we get an opportunity that allows you to look back and say, this was the right thing to do. Sometimes the dynamics don't work out. The landscape doesn't work out. And someone will say to you, you don't have enough money. The worst words of all. But we were able to do that. The thing that I wanted to do, I was there for the 125th anniversary of Yellowstone National Park. Now, we've all been there. I was at the 100th of Yosemite. And, we had a big celebration, 100 years of Yosemite. But I've always looked at these things as more than a birthday cake, that you really leave something behind. And so, because we'd been raising money under the auspices of the Yellowstone Park Foundation, and I'd been to New York many times soliciting money. By the way, you guys can do that under the Take Pride in America Act, even though they tell us we can't. And I'd meet with Sony, I'd meet with Canon, Unilever, and I thought, we need to leave something for the 125th that really means something. And I was able to secure $1.25 million from Unilever for the Old Faithful Visitor Center. And those of you remember that tacky 1950s awful visitor center can thank the men and women and some of you I know in this room donated through the Yellowstone Park Foundation to give a real gift. So those are some of the things that I really consider accomplishments. Working with GYC on killing the New World Mine, I love that. I mean, I don't know whether you were the hand inside of the glove or I was the hand inside of the glove, but we worked well together, both publicly and behind the scenes. And that was one of the best gifts we could give the American public and give Yellowstone, was defeat that poorly planned mine. Challenges for me were the bison management. I hated the way we were managed bison. Every time I sent rangers out to shoot bison with the state, I was aware of federal law that had provided 6 townships of land to the north, expedited acquisition authority by the Secretary of Agriculture and Secretary of Interior. We have not fulfilled that authorization yet. north of Yellowstone National Park. It was recognized in 1899 that winter range was inadequate. And so why are we shooting bison on the very lands that Congress authorized for wintering wildlife? They didn't exclude bison from the statute. So some of these things like that are irrational. I worked with Secretary Babbitt, and we brought out the National Academy of Sciences. And I said to the scientists, we had the best epidemiologists, the best veterinaries, everyone. I said, help us put a stake in the heart of this vampire. This is awful, this bison management issue. And Dan has the book on the shelf in his office. The National Academy of Sciences came back with a report that said, and I remember the quote, while the risk of transmission of brucellosis in the wild from bison to cattle is not zero, it's nearly zero. Okay? And yet we go on with this madness. That was one and continues to be one of the most frustrating of the issues I dealt with. So that's it for me.
On the cusp of finishing winter use, I think within 10 days, winter use will be done. It's almost impossible for me to believe that I'm saying this, but the biggest hurdle to finishing winter use right now is the Office of Management and Budget. Native fish restoration, we're in the process not only on the lake but in the streams of Yellowstone. The concession contract, that contract should be signed and in place by the 1st of December. That'll invest close to $200 million in improving the facilities in Yellowstone, at the same time reducing the footprint of the facilities in Yellowstone National Park. And since everyone seemed to have done challenges, I think the biggest challenge that I've had coming in is, and I think it's an ongoing challenge, it's the building the trust with the stakeholders who we depend on for decisions that are made outside the park that greatly affect what happens within Yellowstone National Park. It's the states, it's the communities, it's really the NGOs, it's everybody. I mean, to build that trust, to have that assurance they can rely on what we're saying, and we can have the conversations we need to have, to ensure the long-term preservation. I think also the thing that I've seen is that the people who want to do things that I think would diminish Yellowstone depend on us to be silent or to be politically correct and to not voice the concerns based on the science, based on the knowledge, based on the management skill and experience that we have managing parks. They depend on us not to be outspoken. These gentlemen didn't do that, and I don't think we're doing it in the park today. That's it.
So since those early days in the 90s, our thinking has evolved dramatically in how we perceive ecosystems and parks and protected areas. What, in your opinion, are the most important steps that we need to take today going forward to ensure the integrity of Yellowstone and the ecosystem as a whole?
Well, I think doing more of the same, actually. I mean, you get organizations like the Coalition. A park is surrounded by a constellation of constituencies of all kinds, and then you have the business communities like West Yellowstone, where we are, that depend on. I mean, they hang on every word we say when we start talking about when we open, when we close. It's really an impact. We have to be sensitive to that. So, there's a whole matrix of things that go on. And a whole lot of people have a piece of the action. So I think, I agree, maybe you said it, maybe you didn't, but I think you did, is that Yellowstone, and not just Yellowstone Park, but we're surrounded by really some great national forests, and the things are in better shape today than, at least in my opinion, than they ever have been. There's ecological management, which sort of precedes actions that you take. You think it through. NEPA is a real pain, believe me. But yet, it forces us through a process to consider impacts on the resource. I mean, it's just really unbelievable how far things have come. I got the cultural resources. I got to Yellowstone. There was one person, a clerk typist, GS4, who represented cultural resources on the staff. Can you believe that? And then we have some iconic things, structures and what have you, and other considerations, and certainly Native Americans and all that ethnology and all that kind of thing. Now, if you look at the concern for cultural resources, and a little aside story, during the Yellowstone fires, you sit down with the incident commander and you talk about values at risk. And then you sign some stuff, you turn the fire over to the incident commander, who by the way, may have a staff of firefighters and other specialists of 1,500 people, and they go to work. And you can consult with them from time to time. But so when we were the North Fork fire, when we were over in Yellowstone, Old Faithful became an issue. So, well, what do we got here? And I said, well, okay, let's just put the meat on the table. We've got the Old Faithful Inn. Losing the Old Faithful Inn is not an option. If we lose the Old Faithful Inn, you're dead meat, and so am I. So we don't lose it. And I'm telling you, those people you can't believe the soaking that place got. For 3 days, poured, water and foam, and even during the fires, there were people so we had a number of people on the roof of that. And there were little firebrands that got caught up there even then. But so cultural resources became a big deal, and it is today. Mike mentioned extremophiles, and then we've entered a whole new arena of intellectual property, which, who ever heard of such a thing? And I think the question answers itself. Things are in better shape now than they've ever been, and we just need to do a whole lot more of the same.
I think that there are things yet that we don't know. The grizzly bear is scheduled for delisting. And if you look at the primary food sources, we heard Dan's reference to making success of mitigating the exotic species, the lake trout, but it's not mitigated yet. And you've lost almost 90% of your cutthroats. That's a primary grizzly bear food source. A secondary food source is the Army cutworm moth. And those of you that have seen films in the fall when the grizzlies go up and roll through the rocks and eat these moths, up to 40,000 a day, up to 240,000 a week. Now, I won't go into which graduate students had to count the feces and pull out the beetle carapaces, but that's how they determined that high energy fat for preservation. When I asked science about, and this all goes under the Fish and Wildlife regulations of habitat quality, and you have to be assured that before you delist an animal that there's quality habitat. No one really understands the life cycle of the Army cutworm moth. And is that habitat, it flies in from the plains. What's it doing in the plains? Who's safeguarding it there? We don't have the science. The park doesn't know that. You can't reach out to partners. You can't go to the Department of Agriculture. So there's some things that here we are, I don't know whether you coined it, Barbie, or someone else, but there's nothing surer to crash than a bandwagon. Here we are, the bandwagon's getting ready for 2014. We're going to delist the grizzly bear. What about the army cutworm moss? Major food source. Huh? There's some things here to safeguard this ecosystem, to safeguard these iconic species, that we have to be more sure about. The other one is white bark pine. Look at what's happened to the white bark pine, both climate change and fungus. So there's 3 huge food sources for grizzly bears, all diminished, all a shadow of their former self. And yet, we're on the road to delisting. Incredible to me. Incredible to the logical mind. There's the politics at work. This is where you come in. Hold them accountable. Make them prove the habitat quality is there. They can't. So I am not as optimistic as Bob. I agree that there have been many things that have been recovered. Others have been diminished. And we still have a lot of threats. We still have knowledge gaps. And so your job is more important than ever. Because once the Interior Department and the Secretary tells the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're going to delist it, and the Park Service is given the nod, you will cooperate, where's that train going? And so, trust, you remember the President Reagan, trust but verify? I think you could trust that the Park Service would do the right thing. You should trust that the Fish and Wildlife Service will act on behalf of, in accordance with federal law, but I've seen them not do it. I've seen the Park Service shy away from its responsibilities. You are all important, and litigation works.
That one's tough to follow. But on that line, I'm going to take 30 seconds for a very short story. When we were dealing with wolves and we were dealing with hunting and trapping regulations as proposed this year, Fish and Wildlife Service, I had explained the stance I was going to take to my bosses in Washington, D.C., and to the Secretary's office. And basically I said we're going to publicly oppose many provisions that are in the hunting and trapping regulations on wolves. And that word soon went down to the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I started to get calls from the Fish and Wildlife Service that basically said nothing that they're doing has anything to do with population level effects on wolves in Montana or Wyoming. And I said, that may be true, but once you delisted them, you gave up your right to tell us what we could say about wolf management in and around Yellowstone National Park. And these are our positions, and they're our positions because it's ecosystem management. I think that the big things that I think we have to, climate change, an incredible issue. One of the things that I'm trying to get the National Park Service to talk about is what are we going to do about climate change? Are we going to use national parks as a laboratories that's going to tell us the effects of climate change? Are we going to do adaptive management? What are we going to do about the white bark pine? Are we going to plant white bark pine in a place like Yellowstone? Or are we not going to plant it? Are we just going to see what the effects are? And I think that's an incredible policy decision. We have drier summers. If the cutthroat trout go up the streams to spawn, but the lakes go down and you block off the return ability of the fry to come back into the lake because should you open that stream up, or should you just look and see what the effects of climate change are? We have made some of those decisions. In the case of cutthroat trout, we're opening the streams. In the case of white bark pine, we haven't made that decision yet if we're going to try to replant. Other parks have. But that's a major policy decision that I don't think the National Park Service has answered yet overall. But I'll end this question with a statement. I believe what we need to do is we need to change the conversation. And we can't change the conversation without people like the Greater Yellowstone Coalition. We need to change the conversation so that when states think about actions, or communities or other federal agencies think about actions that are being taken around Yellowstone National Park or within the ecosystem, that they think about that ecosystem differently. They understand the importance of the ecosystem. We don't deal with it as a single issue decision-making process. We look at it as what's the cumulative effects to go back of all these decisions on this ecosystem. I think too often we make decisions about land use, about migratory animals, about energy development, about invasive species on a single issue federal manager decision-making around the system. We need to figure out whether it's the state or whoever, we're making decisions in consideration of the whole ecosystem.
It's been a great night. We're going to end with one final question. So all of you are parents. You're talking to your own kids and your grandkids in some cases about how to make a better world. And so in the context of GYC and its membership tonight, and you talk about changing the conversation, Dan, so what advice do you have for GYC in being an effective organization moving forward, and the individual members out there in their various communities? And we'll start with Mike Finley, and we'll end with Bob.
I operate the Turner Foundation on the premise that we as human beings function best on our own self-interest. If something is in our self-interest, we will respond. And we're sometimes awakened, reminded, or educated about how we have that self-interest. Do we have skin in the game? I think one of the most important roles that you all can take in GYC is to help people understand that a healthy Yellowstone environment, healthy national forests, and you know, the parks, and Grand Teton included, are only as healthy as the national forests around them. And in many cases, in these budget cuts, they are stepchildren. And they aren't able to do the types of resource management that either directly or indirectly benefits the park. So it's an educational outreach. But it's the work that we do that suggests this is what really matters to you and why this is important, that I think is so key to enlighten self-interest and therefore action. Now, some of our population can't be enlightened. And you can help them see, but they can't see, or they won't see. And in that case, then you need to be the defender. You need to stand up and speak for Yellowstone as you have for years. And if you need to, go to the courthouse. Because watching Yellowstone diminished or watching Yellowstone destroyed, you know, I grew up in Southern Oregon, and we took my relatives to Crater Lake National Park every time they came to town, and every friend. And my parents told me that, isn't it wonderful that we have a national park system and that Crater Lake is protected forever? Only when I came to the National Park Service and through my career did I learn that that was a false statement. These parks are not protected forever. It depends on the integrity of the management team, the intestinal fortitude of the superintendent, and unfortunately, many of them lack that intestinal fortitude to make the right decision They'll duck political decisions and won't stand up and face the wind. Same with forest supervisors surrounding. So it's important to hold this accountable. And that's my final message to you. And I hope you'll maintain the vigilance.
I can't improve on that challenge, but I have something else to add. And I almost feel bad about adding this statement. I'm finding when I talk to people about protecting Yellowstone and protecting this ecosystem, that it's not enough oftentimes that this is the 10,000 more thermal features here than the rest of the world, more geysers, over half the world's geysers are here, the greatest wildlife display on the face of the earth, the largest nearly intact ecosystem in the temperate zone of the world. That's not enough for too many people in terms of why this area should be protected. And when I talk to them, I'm actually starting to talk to them about, if you don't care about Yellowstone and you don't care about protecting it for all those other reasons, it gets back to Mike's self-interest. Care about it because it's one of the biggest economic engines, and this area outperforms almost any other area in the United States. I don't care if you're talking Seattle, Silicon Valley, or any place else. It outperforms it because of the natural systems and the amenities that people are attracted to in this area, whether they're bringing themselves, their businesses, or whatever to this area. So if you don't care about this ecosystem and the integrity of it, care about it because it's good for you to care about it. And that's another message.
Absolutely.
One thing about being last is other guys, they've already said everything you were going to say, and probably better. Now, Finley, he's got a certain affectation and mannerism, and I cannot be that serious about things. But I agree with everything that he said. I think maybe I alluded to it earlier that the matrix of the public and private lands and the federal lands that make up the Greater Yellowstone, I think there's more. I feel good about it. There's more and more of a recognition that this is something worthwhile. It's not everybody's got a little piece of the action and not worrying about the whole thing. And that's one of the missions of the coalition is to worry about the entire thing. And I also agree with Mike about it's not all great. There's the white bark pine a lot of it was burned during the fires. So where are the grizzly bears going? The lake trout taking over where the cutthroat were. So there's not, there's some real challenges for the bears. Although the bears seem to be generally in pretty good shape, at least as far as their numbers are concerned. So things are, in my view anyway, are happening in a positive way, and we really need to keep the drums beating. And the coalition is obviously an organization that should and can do it, and effectively. We've got media here tonight, and I would expect Todd and Angus Thurmer and the others down here to report what they've heard and seen here, and then other people read that, and so on and so on. So.
Let's hear it for these giants.
Oh, thank you, Kenny.
What'd you say?
Oh, thank you.